Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Down a Rabbit Hole with your host, me, CCSUAREZ. Thanks for coming back. Today, we're going to be continuing the conversation of family annihilator cases. Now, last week, y'all know we went over the case of the List family murder, in which John List murdered his entire family, including his mother, wife, and 3 children, and then went on the run for 18 years. He was thankfully caught. But at the beginning of that episode, we did discuss how family annihilators are really divided into 4 different groups. And this comes from David Wilson of Birmingham City University, who has studied family annihilation cases pretty thoroughly. Now, as we went over, those 4 groups are anomic, disappointed, self-righteous, and paranoid. Now, at the beginning of each one of these episodes in this specific series of the podcast, I will be reminding you of this just in case. So by the 4th or 5th family annihilation case we go over, you're probably gonna be like, girl, we know. I just want to remind you so that we can have that conversation at the end of the episode and on the Instagram as well. Follow over on Instagram, Down a Rabbit Hole Podcast, and we can continue that conversation and really see what type of category do you think that each case falls into. Now, in this typology, the anomic killer sees their family purely as a status symbol. When his economic status collapses, he sees them as a surplus. So basically, he doesn't have a need for them anymore, and therefore he murders them. The disappointed killer seeks to punish the family for not living up to his ideals of a family life. Essentially, you're not good enough, you're not doing what I need you to do. I'm disappointed in you, therefore I shall kill you. The self-righteous killer destroys the family to exact revenge upon the mother in an act that he blames her for. You're a horrible wife, I'm gonna kill our kids, and you, and maybe even me. And finally, the paranoid killer kills their family in what they imagine to be an attempt to protect them from something even worse. Now, as we stated in last week's episode, I say we, but I'm the only one in this room right now, but I do believe that the John List case really falls into the paranoid killer category because he was trying to, quote, save his family from the embarrassment of being poor and going bankrupt. And it was really his actions. Some people might say, oh, well, wouldn't that mean he would be a disappointed killer? But he wasn't disappointed in them necessarily. He was disappointed in himself. So I think that's really the differentiation. So I really think that's the difference there. And it really is more about what he was feeling with that certain case. Either way, definitely let me know what you think over on Instagram and even in the comments section of the YouTube video as well, if you would like. And remember, we do trivia over on the Instagram stories of the Down a Rabbit Hole Podcast Instagram page, which is always really fun. Y'all really seem to like that. And to give credit where credit's due, I did get that idea from the Not Another True Crime Podcast Instagram page. They are amazing. They actually just had me on their podcast earlier this week, which is pretty awesome. A huge accomplishment there for me, I feel. They are awesome. I love them. So definitely listen to their podcast as well. All right, y'all, let's go ahead and get into this week's episode. Today, we're going to be talking about Martin Bergen. The opinions expressed in this episode do not necessarily reflect those of the Down a Rabbit Hole podcast. Sensitive topics are discussed. Viewer discretion is advised. Early on the morning of Friday, January 19th, 1900, we're going way back for this one, in a little wooden farmhouse in central Massachusetts, the best catcher the game of baseball had ever seen, a gentle church-going man, an attentive husband, and a doting father of 2, rose from the couch on which he had been sleeping and made his way through the darkness to the kitchen stove. Martin Bergen, 28 years old, was about to build a fire. Out back in the barn where he found his father sleeping, the cows needed milking, and the hens and horses feeding. Martin hadn't quite been himself lately. Over the years, he'd said that humpbacked witches had been scolding him, and lately they were hanging on more grimly than ever. He experienced paranoid delusions, fantasies, lapse in memory, anxiety, nervousness. He was impulsive and he was violent as well. He would even see knives being thrown at him when he was behind the plate. Martin had been acting, quote, strange prior to even joining the baseball team. It seems as though he was such a good catcher that the team really just put up with, I know that sounds bad, but they really did put up with a lot just so that they could have him behind the plate because he truly was such a good catcher. People in Boston even crowned him king of the catchers. He had a bullwhip for an arm and could snap the ball to second base without so much as moving his feet. Hall of Famer Jesse Burkett, a St. Louis outfielder, was quoted as saying, "As a catcher, Martin Bergen was the best the world had ever produced. No man acted with more natural grace as a ball player. The Boston Beaneaters," which honestly is the best name for a baseball team, they forgave his, let's say, mental health hiccups while they were winning in 1897 and 1898. But in the summer of 99, when the team began to struggle, his increasing erratic behavior made him a lightning rod for discontent. That April, his 4-year-old son, Willie, had died of diphtheria while Boston was on the road, and it had troubled Bergen that he could not get back home before the end of the religious service, and he was late to his favorite child's funeral. It sounds really bad to clearly say it was his favorite child, but from everything that I read, it was his favorite child. Bergen said to his neighbors, quote, "It's pretty tough that my boy should be taken away, but it seems a great deal harder to think that I should just get home in time to see him being taken out the door in a box," end quote. It seems that now his demons were really getting to him, wheeling around like crows in his head. He was increasingly distracted, and he even just left the tournament that they were in late July and went back to the farm. For a couple of weeks, he even believed that his teammates were trying to kill him. He believed that the National Baseball League had hired his personal physician to poison him. He had cried like a frightened little boy after unburdening himself of his paranoid fantasies to a reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer and had begged the man not to write what he had said. The reporter complied. Even the cheering at his games had began to agitate him. After his return to the team in August, he played in fewer and fewer games. He was smoking heavily, and he chewed a 10-cent plug of tobacco every single game. That's disgusting. Can you imagine how bad his teeth were? Gross. His doctor listened to his woes and diagnosed the problem as tobacco heart, frayed nerves due to excessive use of nicotine. Martin's mental condition grew worse and worse as the season drew to a close. He sought remedies from doctors and saw 3 different Catholic priests. He rarely missed a Sunday Mass. He was trying to still the demons that he had said were nested in his soul. He would sulk around the clubhouse and often stare into the distance for hours. Even though he was 5'10" and about 170 pounds, he appeared to grow larger and larger and more fearsome to his teammates. The Boston club president, Arthur Sodden, told the other players to please be careful around Martin. Martin's wife, Hattie, had told the doctor that she had no fear of him, nor did she fear for her 2 children, 6-year-old Florence, with pretty brunette curls, and Joe, who was 3 years younger. By January 1900, even though he wasn't getting along with his father, Michael, due to his drinking, on the night of January 18th, when Michael was supposed to start living with the family on the farm, Hattie met her father-in-law at the door and refused to let him inside the house. At one point, Hattie hid Martin's shotgun under the sheets of their bed in the same room where the 2 kids slept. And when Martin got up around 5:30 a.m. to make that fire, he had a couple of shotgun shells in his pocket. After Martin got up, he went to the kitchen, cleaned out the stove, and gathered old papers and laid them on the grate. Bergen then picked up an axe. He went back into the kitchen with the axe in his hand and rounded the corner into the bedroom. Hattie saw him coming toward her. She got up to her feet and raised her hands to protect herself. Now let's back up a little bit. Martin was born in North Brookfield, 55 miles west of Boston, on October 25th, 1871. He was one of 6 children raised by Michael and Anne Delaney Bergen. When Michael was a teenager, baseball was just becoming popular as America's national game. Martin and his younger brother, William, practiced constantly, both as catchers. His brother also played Major League Baseball for 11 years in Brooklyn. Even as kids, when they played on their church team, Martin would throw periodic tantrums. He would toss his gear and stomp off the field if another player earned more of an applause. Everywhere Martin went, trouble seemed to follow. Even within his first year playing in the minors in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1892, he played well, but before the season was even over, he got into an argument with another teammate over what the Sporting News described as, quote, an imaginary grievance, end quote. The other player received a bad beating from Martin. Essentially, Martin beat the shit out of him over allegedly nothing. At Northampton, Massachusetts in 1893, Martin's pure talent as a catcher really began to draw attention. He got offers from several teams around New England. He was known as a phenomenal ball player by his teammates. His teammates also said that he was so cranky that hardly anyone could get along with him, and it was only by the greatest diplomacy that he was even gotten along with at all, end quote. However, in 98, he had become increasingly hostile and unbalanced. According to the Boston Morning Journal, he had assaulted several of the most inoffensive members of the team while in the West. All this came to a boil on July 28th in what the Sporting News would describe as a sensational scene, instigated by Martin over breakfast in a fancy dining room of the Southern Hotel in St. Louis. The night before, on the train coming from Brooklyn, the pitcher, Vic Willis, and other players had begun kidding around with one another. The Sporting News reported, Bergen took a hand in the fun-making, and good fellowship was the rule. Suddenly, Martin grew morose and refused to join in on the horseplay. He growled at Willis, but no one paid any attention to that, as it was nothing unusual for him to relapse into one of his spells when he would not talk with or be talked to by anyone, end quote. The next morning, Willis came down to breakfast and was escorted by the head waiter to sit next to Bergen. The 22-year-old Willis, a rookie, 6'2", on his way to winning 25 games that season, greeted his catcher as he sat down. "If you don't get away from me," Martin snarled, "I'll smash you, sure." That's such a strange threat. Isn't it so weird how back in the day, like 120 years ago, just how people's vernacular was so strange? If someone said, "I'll smash you today," I would just start laughing. Like, what are you, the Hulk? Anyways, essentially, Willis refused to move, and Martin reached over and slapped him on the face. All hyped up from being slapped, Willis appeared ready to fight, but he reeled himself back in. Several players urged him on from another table and then out of the room. Several other players got him away from Martin, and then finally out of the room completely. Willis later said, "I'll make a sacrifice of my personal feelings and swallow the insult in the interests of the club. But if Martin makes another break at me, we'll settle the question of which is the better man." Martin refused to apologize, claiming he was made the butt of the jokes on that train, and he was warned that if he got in any other trouble, he would be dealt with. The manager told him, "If you say the word, I'll begin negotiations and I'll trade you at once." Bergen said that he wanted to stay, but that nobody would make him look a fool. The other players trying for a 5th championship in 8 years admired Bergen as a hustling, hardworking player, but were livid over the slapping incident. It's his disposition to be gloomy, morose, and we give him all the latitude we can in order to keep the peace with him, an unnamed player said. In addition to paranoia, Martin Bergen most likely suffered from schizophrenia with a touch of manic depression. "If I had to make a diagnosis, that would be it," said Dr. Carl Salzman, professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. So I'd say he knows what he's talking about. He had examined various contemporary accounts of Martin Bergen's behavior. Schizophrenia, Salzman says, can be marked by delusions such as Bergen's experience, a belief that something is happening that isn't, and it's usually pretty threatening. Other symptoms are withdrawal, inability to socialize, or fear of socializing, flat or dull feelings, not the usual range of emotions or expression, and difficulty thinking or controlling one's thoughts. It's a brain disease that causes that person to be more vulnerable to the usual stressors of life. Today, someone like Bergen would be treated with drugs and psychotherapy, but at the turn of the last century, there weren't any medications to treat this illness. There was no psychotherapy. There essentially was no therapy that could treat this, and many people with that same set of symptoms were put in hospitals and locked up. The only medicine that Martin seemed to have been prescribed were bromides, I'm sure I'm butchering that word, which are mild sedatives that, according to Salzman, were, quote, commonly used at the time to quiet people down, especially if they were very anxious or had trouble sleeping. However, with someone in Martin Bergen's state, that medication would have been worthless. Stresses on the field and off were getting worse and worse through 1899. The crowd seemed to grow louder and closer. He felt like everything was closing in. His wife became ill with tuberculosis. His paranoid fantasies had become self-fulfilling. Following the St. Louis incident, his teammates indeed, quote, gave him a wide berth and no longer wanted anything to do with him and were no longer cordial. After his son Willie died in April, Bergen began to imagine that the players were making light of the boy's death and joking around about it behind his back, which obviously is horrible. Of course, we don't think, I say we, me, I don't think that's what was happening, but when someone has schizophrenia, what is happening in their head is real to them. And that's one of the many reasons why, one, it's so sad, but also it's so absolutely terrifying because what they're experiencing to themselves is real because they are seeing and hearing it. Sodden, the Bean-Eaters, which is the baseball team, in case you forgot, best baseball team name ever, the Bean-Eaters president had warned the manager that Martin Bergen was dangerous and he feared that he might shoot someone. Players thought that Bergen had grown more and more detached from reality. Some attributed this to his drinking, but he was known to be a temperate man and never hung out at saloons when they were on the road, and instead he would read in his room after dinner rather than hanging out with all the guys. When the team played at home, Bergen, rather than stay at a hotel, he would commute by train from his home. In July, on their way to Cincinnati at the beginning of a long Western road trip, the Boston players were gathered in groups in their special car, on a train car, laughing and playing cards as Bergen brooded alone in the corner. The train stopped briefly in Washington, D.C. Suddenly, a New York player, whose team had also been in a separate car, dashed into the Boston car and asked what was going on with Martin Bergen. We looked about the car and we couldn't see him, one of his fellow players recalled. Then someone told us to look out on the platform. There was Bergen, walking away from the train as fast as possible. Our train had already started again, so we couldn't stop him. It would be the longest and most spectacular walkout of Bergen's career. And it infuriated his entire team because it left them, as they were competing for their third championship in a row, with only their backup catcher. Bergen eventually did go back and keep playing baseball for at least 2 more years. But he began acting wildly again and complaining of the circus going on in his head and telling of an urge to run off into the woods. The day after the season ended, his brother William summoned the doctor. "My head is spinning," Martin said to the doctor. "I have lots of strange thoughts." "What sort of thoughts?" the doctor asked. "I have a thought that someone is trying to injure me. I don't know what I'm doing. I played ball all summer, and people tell me that I played fine, but I can't remember hardly any of it. In fact, I don't remember hardly any of anything of that last game. I played in a trance, except for when it was all over, and some person came up to me and said, 'Martin, you played great,' and he gave me a cigar, but I was afraid to smoke it. It was a big cigar, and it looked like it was going to poison me, so I thought this man had been told to kill me." As we said, back then there wasn't really any type of medication that would help with schizophrenia, and essentially there was a mixture or a medication which would essentially just calm them down, so kind of like a Xanax, and that's all the doctor gave him. So he mixed it together for him, and it was in liquid form, and Martin's wife gave it to him. The next day, though, when the doctor came back, Martin confessed, "I thought someone from the National League had found out that you were my family physician and had arranged for you to give me some poison. I did not take it from my wife because I didn't wish hers to be the hand that poisoned me." He also told his doctor that he left his team in July and jumped off the train because he thought that the players were trying to kill him. In November, the family doctor visited the farm again to tend to Hattie, who had tuberculosis. He found her lying on the couch and coughing up blood. Martin was wringing his hands in anguish. "The sight of that blood drives me crazy," he yelled. On Sunday, January 14th, Martin visited his doctor's office to pick up medicine for Hattie. The doctor inquired about his health, and Bergen said that he had visited a doctor in Kansas City during the summer, curious about Bergen's memory, so his family physician asked what route he had taken when he traveled west. Martin did not recall. He did remember playing baseball in St. Joseph, Missouri, he said, but that was all. As he left, he said, "Oh, this has been a very pleasant talk, and yet it's so strange how it has rattled me. I'm almost crazy," which just sounds terrifying to be around. Can you imagine? You're super sick, you're coughing up blood, you're trying to recover, you're on the couch, and your husband is just full on having conversations with himself and thinks you're a witch. The brain is a terrifying thing, isn't it? 4 days later, on Thursday, January 18th, Bergen rose early on the farm to help his father with some chores and cooked breakfast for his family. He had ordered 25 cents worth of groceries from Boston the day before, but he had no sleigh with which to fetch the goods from town. So he stopped over at Miss Daniel Collins' farm to borrow hers. That was his neighbor, clearly. She saw him walking his horse and harness onto her place with his 2 kids, and she yelled, "Hello, here comes Farmer Bergen." Like the fans in the stands at all of the games, the gentle folk around North Brookfield had never seen a dark side of Bergen. Bergen laughed and said, "What kind of farmer do you think I make, Miss Collins? Do you think I make a good farmer?" They joked around a bit, and as he was hitching the horse to the sleigh, his neighbor asked, "Are you going to be playing ball again?" And he responded, "No, I will never play another game of ball." As most farmers and ranchers are, Martin was an early riser. So it's no surprise that he woke up at about 5:30 in the morning and started about his day. However, it is surprising that instead of chopping wood when he got the axe from the shed, he went and raised the blade to his wife, who stood by the bed. Oh my God, that rhymed. Martin brought down the blade to the left side of her head, crushing her forehead and killing her instantly. She fell onto the bed with her arms still raised above her head. Florence and Joe, in their nightclothes, ran screaming out of the room. Martin ran after them and caught the boy with the blade along the top of the head, severing the crown of his skull, then picked up the body outside of the bedroom door and threw it into the bedroom just on the floor. Florence had hidden behind a kitchen chair, but Martin saw her and went after her. He missed her once with the axe, breaking off a piece of the wooden chair, but then killed her with a blow to the head in front of the stove. Surrounded with his dead family, Bergen took a straight razor off of the kitchen shelf, stood before the mirror above the sink, and cut his own throat with such force that he nearly decapitated himself. The razor fell on the table by the sink. Martin died next to Florence on the kitchen floor. Later that morning, Michael, Martin's father, got up in the barn and went into the house. He tried the front door, but it was locked. He heard no movement inside. He went to Miss Collins' place and told her that the house, usually bustling in the morning, was silent and that all the curtains were drawn. "Go back and milk the cows," the neighbor said, "and then try to get inside the house." Almost noon, and Michael decided to let himself in through the shed, and he instantly saw the carnage by the stove. Less than 8 years had passed since the most infamous axe murders in U.S. history. You know, Lizzie Borden, she killed her dad. You know, the Bergen family murder-suicide would not achieve such long-lasting notoriety, but it did still make some headlines across the nation, especially since it was involving one of the most famous baseball players of the day. Hundreds of people, some of them riding in horse-drawn taxis from town, gathered around the Bergen house and peered ghoulishly through the windows as doctors, policemen, the coroner, and the undertaker all moved around the bodies, trying to piece together what happened. Keep in mind, back in the day like this, there was no secure crime scene type of deal. I mean, people would just walk through. And I mean, as you can tell, do you think if there was a multiple homicide case these days, we would just be able to get up on these people's porch and look into the windows? Absolutely not. But very different times back then. The next day, in a steady rain, the bodies were taken in 3 hearses to St. Joseph's Church in North Brookfield, where 800 mourners gathered inside to hear the service. Only 2 men from the league attended the funeral: a neighbor, Connie Mack of the Milwaukee team, and Sliding Billy Hamilton, Bergen's roommate on the road. Could you imagine being his roommate? My goodness. And that is the insane, horrible case of the Bergfeld murders. The best catcher in baseball, Martin Bergen, and his struggle of a battle with his own mind. Now, again, just like last episode, I do think that Martin Bergen falls into the paranoid killer category. It is a little tough, though, because he, of course, wasn't in, quote, his right mind, end quote. So I think it's very tough to actually put him into one of these categories, since he may have seen them as witches or like they were being possessed by something. But either way, I think when when that's the case, that they do fall into the quote paranoid killer category, since they are experiencing paranoia and some type of delusion. Either way, it's still awful. And don't you worry, in this series, in the next episodes, we are going to cover ones that do fall into the the other three categories. It's not all just going to be the paranoid killer, although it seems like all of them are, because obviously no one who is of sound mind would just murder their entire family. But at least this one killed himself though too. I say at least as if it's better. I personally think it's better if they off themselves as well, because I don't think you should be alive if you murder your whole family, especially kids. Obviously the whole family's innocent, but little babies. Also, if this episode does seem a little bit more chopped up than usual, I do apologize. There were a few parts that were really hard for me to get through, especially about how his daughter was hiding behind the chair in the kitchen. That just really, really got to me. So I appreciate your understanding. I hope y'all enjoyed this episode of Down a Rabbit Hole with CC Suarez. That's me. If you did, be sure to go rate and review over on Spotify. They have a little rating system as well now. And then also on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Listen, even if you listen to the podcast on YouTube or Spotify or Apple, anywhere you listen to it, please be sure to go rate and review on the other platforms as well. That helps me so much, and I appreciate you immensely. If you would like to support the podcast, other than just rating and reviewing and subscribing, feel free to become a channel member of the YouTube channel. That is CC Suarez over on YouTube. Thank you so much to the current channel members for really making this podcast happen. I could not do it without you. The Down a Rabbit Hole podcast is produced by Chelsea Suarez, Wiggum Suarez, and Tony Suarez. All episodes are written and researched by Chelsea Suarez and Tony Suarez as well. Again, thank you to our channel members for making this happen. We really do appreciate the support. We will see you next time on another episode of Down a Rabbit Hole.